everyone. Welcome to another episode of Africa as a Country Talk. If you don't know who I am, I'm Will Shoki, streaming as always from Johannesburg, South Africa. And I'm joined, as always, by my co-presenter, Sean Jacobs, who's in Brooklyn, New York. And this is AIAC Talk, which is a weekly talk and interview show from Africa as a Country. We broadcast every Tuesday at 7 p.m. East African time, 5 p.m. if you're in Dakar in Senegal, or 6 p.m. if you, like me, are in Johannesburg. And our show is produced, as always, by the magnificent Antoinette Engel, all the way from Cape Town.
This is episode 36. I don't know if we'll mention that.
I don't keep count anymore. I think we've matured into the game. There's no point.
I keep joking that we passed the
age. Arrogant.
we're past the age of all the youth leagues of the different organizations.
Exactly.
In any case, today is April 27th. It is a significant day for two countries on the African continent, Sierra Leone and South Africa. These two countries are separated by more than 5,000 kilometers along the Atlantic Ocean, which is a long distance along the coast from West Africa to Southern Africa. But today they both celebrate emancipation from white minority rule. In Sierra Leone, it's called Independence Day, and in South Africa, it's called Freedom Day. To help us assess the road traveled since independence in Sierra Leone in 1960 and South Africa since 1994, we invited first Sisonke Msimang from South Africa, and then Oluwaseun Babalola and Ishmael Beah or Beah. So the young country first. I don't know why we did that, and then we go to the country with a lot of experience. But more on our guests later.
And a reminder, if you missed our show last week, it was a great one. We discussed one of our favorite subjects, which is the connection between football or soccer and politics. And I just poking fun. And we were just looking at specifically the entanglement between South African football and English football during colonialism and apartheid. And then we spoke about the news that upended the footballing world last week, which was the short-lived European Super League. And for that, we were joined with Chris Bolzmann, who's a South African sports scholar, as well as Tony Karen, who's an old friend of the show and Africa as a Country collaborator, who teaches on the politics of global soccer and the graduate program in international affairs at the New School in New York. Clips from that episode, as always, are on our YouTube channel. But please do check out the whole thing on our Patreon, where you can also find all of the episodes from our archive.
So remember to hit the like button below and subscribe on our YouTube, as well as follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And please, as Will says, subscribe to our Patreon, where you can help fund Africa as a Country in general. Now to today's program. And our first segment, we had to pre-record earlier today because of time differences. Hi, welcome back. We are joined by Sisonke Msimang. Sisonke is a South African writer whose work is focused on race, gender, and democracy. And on top of writing for a range of international publications, he's the author of Always Another Country, a memoir of exile and home, and The Resurrection of Winnie Mandela, which was published in 2018. Sisonke currently lives in Australia. So to be nice to her, we pre-recorded this part of the program. So let's welcome Sisonke to the program.
There Hi, Sean. Hi, William.
So Sisonke, let's start with a personal question. Today in South Africa is known as Freedom Day, April 27th. It commemorates the 1994, the first elections in South Africa. What does Freedom Day mean to you?
That's a tough question to answer. On the one hand, Freedom Day means something incredibly personal to me. And on the other hand, of course, it's a historic day which has been clouded by the contemporary reality of what South Africa has become and is becoming, which is less than joyful. So I try to hold in my head and in my heart this kind of the contradictions. So on the 27th of April, 27 years ago, I was in Chicago with a bunch of other South African students. We had organized and pooled our money and got on the road and driven from Minnesota a 10-hour drive overnight so that we could be at the consulate, so that we could vote. And of course, for myself, it was the first time I was walking into the South African embassy, into the consulate. It was not a place that I would have felt comfortable or felt at home. And so it was the first time I'm walking into that place, and we were ushered in and given little tea and scones and treated like royalty because we were a big group of us. And then we all were given our ballot papers, and we folded them up and we voted. And it was remarkable, and it was very, very special to feel as though I was on the other side of the world, but part of something that was so momentous and so full of hope. And, you know, like every single cliche, it's amazing to have a piece of your life where you live and you are in step with history and you feel it as it's happening. It's not like you look back on it and, you know, sometimes you look back and you're like, oh, that was a special time. You know, I wish I had known. No. That one, we felt it on that day. So there's a sense of nostalgia on a deeply personal level. And so it will always be a special day for me in terms of personal memory. And then, of course, there is the reality of the present situation we find ourselves in South Africa, as having been very much betrayed, as a democracy that is in a long, drawn-out crisis, paralyzed in crisis. I think that's a good way of describing South Africa's situation.
I think the feeling of nostalgia that you describe, I think, used to be a feature of every single Freedom Day celebration. Everyone would recall fondly that day because of how momentous it was, as you described. So I'm interested, when you think of Freedom Day as it's celebrated this year, do you think this is something that most South Africans still resonate with? Has the day sort of lost some of its sheen? I mean, just before this, interestingly, I was on Twitter, and someone was posting a screen grab of two different Freedom Day commemorations happening. One was by the Economic Freedom Fighters, South Africa's third largest party. The other one, the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was speaking. The EFF one only had like 3,000 viewers. Ramaphosa's one only about 800 viewers. And they were posting this as a sort of a jab at Ramaphosa to say, oh, look, the EFF, more viewers. But, you know, for both of them, it's still a shockingly low amount of attendance. I mean, virtual, and obviously there's tremendous barriers to most South Africans being able to attend virtual events. But I think sort of suggests that for a lot of South Africans, this is just now a public holiday.
Yeah, absolutely. No question. And of course, increasingly, I think nostalgia is not appropriate for the South African context. So I'm trying to prepare for a little talk that I have to give, and I've been reading Michelle Wright, whose work I haven't been that familiar with, and she talks about the physics of Blackness, right? And so she's talking about this idea of critiquing the Black Atlantic, so critiquing this idea that Black people's histories begin with this Middle Passage, that time is linear, and that if you begin to talk about Black people in the New World as only having begun that existence through the Middle Passage, what you do is you feed in, you're buying into this idea that time is linear and that the progress of any people is marked by time's progression in this direction. And I find that stuff really fascinating. I think it's really interesting to think about, you know, time in that sense. And so if you apply that to a whole range of contexts, what she then says is she critiques the idea of the present. And she says, if you think about it, time as the now, and if you think about time as the now in the sense of time as something that expands, right? If you think about the laws of physics. So what we know now is also informed by what has happened and what we can imagine forward will happen. So we can't bring nostalgia to this moment because we know that the present moment in which we sit is one of deep poverty, deep inequality, one in which the past has already happened. And so we can't pretend as though nostalgia is an appropriate response to what we are living with at this moment. So those displays, I think, are hollow. They're kind of celebrations of a freedom that hasn't fully arrived. And I don't think any of us expected that freedom would have arrived within 30 years, given the incredible levels of inequality with which we knew we were faced, and more importantly, the resistance we knew we would face from capital. So we always knew that the market was not interested in the forms of reorganized, social formations that South Africa presented as a possibility. We always knew that was going to be the case. So when I talk about what hasn't happened, I don't talk about it as though we expected perfection, but I do think to think about the now as a moment in which we also know what has happened in the past is really, really important. I don't know if I'm getting too theoretical or if I'm making myself clear, but it does seem as though nostalgia is the wrong way to think about it. And so that's why I'm careful and guarded in saying nostalgia for me at a personal, emotional, level. But to think about nostalgia more broadly is not appropriate. And I think that's where all of these political parties are stuck. They retreat consistently into nostalgia, which is easy when you've got such a clear narrative as South Africa, but it's too easy.
Right. I think I saw yesterday there was a protest in Johannesburg where the ANC was standing on the side of the street, demanding that this one road must be renamed after Winnie Mandela. And there were a couple of responses to it, but one was that this is kind of what nationalist movements can resort to, right? This kind of, you draw out, okay, we gotta let the people talk about Winnie Mandela because maybe that will get them fired up. And then the other one is like the ANC runs the city of Johannesburg, and it actually did announce in 2018 that they were going to rename that road after Winnie Mandela. So why they are protesting? And this gets to your point of the kind of the hollowness. For everybody, it's also very clear that these things are quite hollow. But I want to ask this one other question about the present, the now, which is that some people argue that we've sort of reached the end in South Africa of a kind of a project that is run by a nationalist movement, and they're sort of describing what they refer to as we're already in a moment of post-national liberation, like we're beyond the politics of the national movement. Where do you see the interesting politics developing in South Africa? Like if we're thinking post-national, we're not trying to say the ANC is over. The ANC manages, as we said in a couple of weeks ago in one of these programs, when it has elections, most people will still turn up for the ANC on balance. But we have to. But in terms of politics and in terms of how we feel about the present, where do we see those interesting politics happen that can make us imagine something else other than this that we've inherited?
I don't know. I honestly have no idea. I think that's a good question for William, who's living in South Africa, who's reporting, who has views on these things because he's in touch with people. I honestly, I feel at my wit's end with South African politics because of the dominance of the ANC and because its absolute refusal to reform itself in any way. That's not going to happen. But it will continue to be the dominant party for a very long time because of the absence of any credible opposition. So I actually, that's a really good question, Sean. What's your sense, William? What's your sense of this?
I think my sense, I'm in a similar position to you where I also have no idea what it might be. I think whatever it is, what I can say is that whatever it is, it will be unexpected. I think no one will predict what it would be. And I think the important thing is that I think a lot of us expect that the politics, which will transcend the national liberation politics, is going to be something progressive. Whereas I think what is probably even more likely is that it might be something progressive. It might be something right-wing. I think, for example, if you look at today, one of the top trending tweets in South Africa, and Twitter is not by any account an all-encompassing measure of actual sentiment on the ground, but one of the top trending tweets is foreigners. And the sort of homegrown right-wing nationalist politics that we've seen glimmers of since 2008, the first spate of xenophobic attacks, which coincided with the 2008 financial crisis. I think, to me, that seems like it's slowly becoming a viable political tendency in South Africa that could challenge the ANC's hegemony. And it might not be something progressive. And I think what a lot of people are realizing today is that, well, if the left wants to seriously mount a challenge to what might emerge from the wings in a regressive way, then it needs to get its act together. But I think this provides a nice sort of segue into the question we wanted to ask, which is about the national liberation politics, which is starting to sort of lose credibility now. You recently wrote an article for Labham's Quarterly during the pandemic, talking about how violence was widespread in the liberation struggle. So, I mean, what I just said now touches on it a little bit, but what do you think the legacy of that national liberation violence has meant for South Africa and its political possibilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things that it's meant. On the one hand, of course, the legacy at a social level is not around violence, is not one that we can lay solely at the feet of the of the nationalist movements of the liberation struggle. Of course, that belongs primarily to the apartheid regime, which itself was so incredibly violent, right? So it is the author. I think there's no getting around the fact that the apartheid regime and the colonial state before that are the authors of the violence that we see everywhere in South Africa still today. But that we also have to recognize, and I think we have to recognize that looking backward, that the mode of struggle that was chosen brought with it very particular consequences. And using violence both against the enemy, but more importantly, in some ways, against ourselves as a language, as a mechanism to resolve power conflicts, has had a lasting consequence on how we do politics. And so I think that hasn't been adequately dealt with or talked about in contemporary South Africa. It hasn't been talked about a lot since 1994, in part because I think we were afraid of how that conversation, particularly what happened in KwaZulu-Natal, feeds into a narrative about Black savagery. We know that it was a convoluted and complicated conflict that was, on the one hand, supplied with arms and all sorts of things by the regime, and on the other, was also fed by really regressive notions of masculinity, a kind of rigid, hierarchical way of being that is actually, and I can say this as a Zulu person, quite unique to Zulu people, right? And I think that level of specific conversation that is open has been hard for South Africans to have, because the national project also insisted that ethnic differences made no difference. So there was all this reality that was hitting up against the narrative of what it meant to fight a national struggle. And post-1994, we had to keep that narrative going. And in fact, what we did post-1994 was pretend as though the past was only glorious. And if you pretend that the past was only glorious, then you can't have those conversations. Now that the war is over, and now that we must build a new society, how can we not talk about these things? But that's precisely what we did. Papered them over for the sake of, this linear idea of progress. So the nation begins in South Africa in 1994, and this is part of what I was trying to grapple with in the Lapham's Quarterly piece. The nation begins in 1994, and yet, of course, the state precedes that nation. How can it be? What's going on? How do we reconcile those concepts? And I think these are some of the fundamental questions that South Africa hasn't answered. For a long time, for the first 20 years, I think we focused a lot on this notion of reconciliation and truth and how we thought about white people and Black people and forging this rainbow nation. That was really a core central focus. And of course, as we've seen, the attrition of white people in the country, right? In 1994, we had 13% of the population is white. And now we're looking at about 7%. With, of course, a disproportionate weight and all of that kind of thing, but also demographically, such a small group of people. So why constantly center that group of people in our analysis, in our thought, and in our notion of nation? So I'm not saying ignore white people completely, but I am saying that the disproportionate energy that we have spent on this small, diminishing number of people, when in fact, the question of nation for South Africans, particularly when it comes to violence, both to ourselves in a very parochial sense, if you don't want to even think about the Pan-African project. So to ourselves as Black South Africans, even that, to me, demographically, certainly, is a far more import in how you build nation. And then, of course, when we tackle issues of xenophobia, what it means to be, all of these things. So for me, I really do think that we have been sidetracked by the nationalist story, the need to continue to adhere to what we said during the liberation days, because there was this big enemy. And that enemy is now, no longer such a strong, such a strong force. And I think we have to have the sort of reserves and the sort of capacity to have those conversations that lead us out of this idea of, what the nation used to be.
No, you're right about that. Enemy is increasingly prone to outbursts and just craziness, right? Like writing strange and dumb books. But it's and so because of the unequal nature of like how media works in South Africa, you're right. There is an overemphasis on sort of the white-black distinction in South Africa, and just on that, I think for apartheid to reproduce itself, it just didn't need white people. Like when you say the state, like in what is now 5 out of the 9 provinces of South Africa, essentially the apartheid that people experienced was at the hand of traditional authority, was at the hand of Black local authority, and we have to go and confront those questions. But we can. I was going to give you all the superlatives. You're brilliant, and we can speak. We can we can talk to you forever, but we know it's late and where you are, and so we're going to ask you one final question, which is we're going to keep asking you the controversial ones. And this is our one final question. A library burned down some weeks ago at the University of Cape Town, which by the way was the site, I think, of one of the potentials for another kind of politics. The fees must fall, Rose must fall. I mean, another time we should unpack that and see what could have been. And of course, some people cheered on this fire. This was interesting that some people decided to cheer on the fire of these historical documents in the African Studies Library at UCT. You've written previously about the violence that occurred during South Africa's student movement, and you wrote there that the task for this generation of activists is to reimagine power, and this means resisting the impulse to use power in a way that demeans and cheapens and exploits. Why do you think this is so imperative? And this might be a good way to end this here.
Yeah, because I think that the spectacle has always been easy in South Africa. It's easy to turn and look anywhere in South Africa and see a spectacle of poverty, a spectacle of violence, a spectacle of inhumanity. That is it's not hard to turn and see it, and it's of course not hard to be outraged by it. And because it's important, in fact, to be outraged by it, that can mean that it's easy to slip into modes of resisting the spectacle that use the spectacle themselves. And I think that's that freedom and justice are sustained when we think more carefully about that. So in the case of UCT, I think in the case of this student activism, what we saw there was a real attempt to engage the spectacle with really powerful symbolism. But then I think it was very difficult to move beyond the symbolism into creating the kind of cross-class, deeply rooted movements that were going to sustain the push beyond the single issue, beyond the campus, indeed beyond what is traditionally understood as the political sphere. So I think we get trapped by the spectacle because it's so easy to get sidetracked by it, to be honest. And I think that's the challenge. And I'm glad there are younger people than I who have the energy to think that through and to act on it. But on the fire this last week at UCT, I found it hard to comment about it. And again, one of the nice things about getting older is the realization that not everything requires commentary. And part of why I did find it hard to comment about was because there is something that worries me about academia as fetish. And when I think about the ways in which on a daily basis poor Black people suffer very much, even if we just stick to fire, not just as metaphor, but as a reality, if we think about how fires ravage every winter shacks across our country, when we think about what gets lost in fires that cannot be quantified, when we think not just about lives lost, but one of the sexy topics that all academics, I'm lucky because I get to engage with academia, but from a distance. I have no institution, no one is paying my salary, I'm not a professor, I don't have a PhD, but one of the cool topics that you people are all talking about is this idea of the archive, right? So, reclaiming Black women's voices from the archive and all of this stuff. And then you think about, poor Black women in South Africa who really are, in fact, our oral archive, who are killed daily by fires, and for whom the sentiments of the commentariat, of the bourgeoisie, of we, our hearts don't go out in the same way. And so of course, I think that is a terrifying, horrible loss. And I wish that had not happened. But I'm also mindful of books and academic spaces as a kind of fetishized space for all the reasons we understand. And I'm also mindful that if I don't speak up about the fire at UCT, it doesn't mean anything. But there are many, many of us who must speak up about the structural and continuing literal violence that happens against poor people in South Africa on a daily basis. South Africans and non-South Africans who are poor in South Africa. And that, to me, seems to do the work. In the ideal scenario, we talk about both all the time. But when we know that we live in an attention economy where actually what trends, it does get noticed, then I think sometimes a silence is actually an important declaration of where your allegiances lie. So those are my thoughts about the fire. I didn't say anything, not because I don't care, but because I do think it's important to think about these things more deeply.
You did say a lot. You said a lot there.
Yeah.
You said a lot of what we think about also, what we've been thinking, but you articulated it best. So on that note, because it's not because it's late, but because we have to let you go, because we have other guests coming up too. And happy Freedom Day to you.
Thank you very much.
going to be joined now by Oluwaseun Babalola and Ishmael Beah. Seun is a Sierra Leonean-Nigerian-American filmmaker who founded DO Global Productions, a video production company specializing in documentaries. Her focus is to create and collaborate in projects across the globe while providing positive representation for people of color. And Ishmael, born in Sierra Leone, is the New York Times bestselling author of A Long Way Gone, Memoirs of a Boy Soldier, as well as Radiance of Tomorrow and Little Family, his latest novel, which was released in 2020. So thank you very much to the both of you for joining us on today's show to mark Independence Day. I mean, it's sorry to make you, first of all, have to show up on a holiday. We also realized ourselves, just as before we record the show, like, hold on, we're making ourselves work on a holiday, but I suppose it's the best time for people to tune in and to reflect on the questions we want to probe today. So to get started with that, I think let's start with a very personal question, which is for the both of you, what does Independence Day mean to you? Maybe Seun, you could get us started.
Sure. I mean, the general concept of Independence Day means, freedom and opportunity, right? Like freedom of choice, liberation to choose our destiny. But I guess if I want to talk specifically about Sierra Leone, that one is like a push and pull. So it's like I'm happy that Sierra Leone has the freedom and has gotten past so much strife and continues to adapt and evolve. But also it's kind of like, okay, well, where has that freedom led us? So it's like there's themes of hope. So I'm going to go forward with the hope that like society will continue to shift, and because that's human nature. And there's more access to have these type of discussions on a larger scale. But Independence Day to me, I think I'm hoping that things will move in the right directions, even if it's not perfect right now. So that's how I'm thinking of it.
And I guess I would jump in. And for me, it is a day that I hope it is not one that we necessarily celebrate. On this day, I think more about the Mandong Empire, the Songhai Empire, the Empire of Mali, our roots, who we are, because I think that has been forgotten. And celebrations of such today further pushes us away from understanding who we are. So, which makes it difficult to really pave a way into the future that is based on our own traditions, our own ideas of being, of intellectual thought, curiosity, and all of the ideas of freedom that we always had. So for me, it shouldn't be even a conversation. But since we have it and the date is there, I think these conversations are necessary, perhaps, to bring our people back to understand who we are, irrespective of anybody else. We are already a people free before the idea of being free from somebody else was introduced into our consciousness. So for me, that's where I am.
We want to get back later to this idea that Ismail's bringing up here about kind of the ideas about ourselves and the past. But before we do that, just to connect to Will's question, I mean, the independence for Sierra Leone, right? It's been from the outside, it would seem as a very long and difficult history since then. And both for people who live at home and I suppose for people in the diaspora, if you had to assess that independence, it's young by any standard. What is it, like 60 years maybe? But what would you, if you would say, like, what are the things that have been done right? And I don't want to call it like what has been the bad stuff, but if you had to have like a ledger and you had to weigh up and you say, like, for the average Sierra Leonean, these are some of the good that came out of independence, and these are some of the things that they might deem didn't work out so well. Either of you can go.
Good question.
Yeah, that's going to take some thought. I feel like that's really tough because I feel like if I'm honestly speaking, the average Sierra Leonean is leading a difficult life. I feel like there might be a more sense of community now, but in terms of just societal progression, especially in just a lot of issues, especially with women, economics, job opportunities, government corruption, I really don't think a lot is going well. And so where does that leave us? Which is, I guess, the purpose of this whole talk, right? Yeah.
I mean, to jump in on that, I believe that, a country like Sierra Leone has been through many difficult things. And I think even in the first year of our so-called independence, we are already running against a wall in terms of where we were going as a country, just because of the political and economic structures that our so-called leaders at the time inherited were not one in favor of the average Sierra Leonean succeeding. So it has always been an uphill battle, even when it comes to gender, when it comes, this is why I want to take it back to the roots again. When you look at our idea of even gender, our idea of roles in society, we had one that included everybody. So we had people like Madame Yoko in Sierra Leone history, who was one of our early political figures. But all of that we've forgotten. The average Sierra Leonean does not even understand that such things existed, that we had a political system that worked for us. So I think it's always been an uphill battle, which now we are seeing the translation of it in the lives of the average Sierra Leonean. It's always been an uphill battle. We have never tried to shift and look at some things differently. And think about this idea of independence in Sierra Leone. We didn't fight for it. It was kind of handed to us in a way that, well, we decide when you're going to be independent, and here are the ways it's going to be, And so from that point of view, things are always going to be difficult until we really revisit this question of what happened on that day. What happened on that day? Do we need to continue celebrating that day? Do we need to find a different way of looking at ourselves? If we don't answer those questions, the rest is going to continue to just plague us. Even the urbanization of the country itself has had its own problems. So that that alone is everybody is in Freetown for the same resources that are not available. So that already is a big problem.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's important to have your identity rooted in something other than other people's perceptions of you. And since, with the onslaught of just like war and coups and disease, I'm not sure Sierra Leone has ever really gotten the opportunity to do that in terms of identity post-colonization.
Just to be like, if you want, do normal things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What does it mean to be in the world? Like it's never had an opportunity to just like pause and, the people to pause and say, I would like to surf, like some of the work you've done. I just want to surf.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a woman and I'd like to surf. Like that, people have never really even done that regular thing. They haven't really had that opportunity to think about their place in the world, even, if you want.
Exactly.
And to riff off what Sean just said, to ask a question about that, and Ishmael and Seun, you were talking about it just now, what would you say is the perspective of the average Sierra Leonean on a day like this? Is Independence Day something that resonates with a lot of Sierra Leoneans when we consider, since it happened in 1961, the tremendous difficulty you mentioned that Sierra Leoneans have been through? And is it something that also, for most people, sort of also connects them to a prior history where this idea of freedom, as you said, Ishmael, was something that Sierra Leoneans have in their history as understanding that it doesn't just mean being free from an oppressor, but it's something that at some stage existed on their own terms. So how do people make sense of a day like this? Are they celebrating it? Are they ignoring it? What happens on a day like this, as far as you know?
Ishmael, did you want to go?
All right. Listen, the fact of the matter is that the average Sierra Leonean, or our public, it's not educated enough about their own past and their own history. If you have gone to school in the sort of educational models that was left to us, and that we continue to push, you are not critical about who you are. So let's even ask the question about what it means to be Sierra Leonean. I don't think there is even, if you ask a lot of people, they may not even have an answer to that because they've never stopped to even think about it, to connect where are they coming from, what are their roots, what is their history of who they are. As I mentioned again, irrespective of the exterior or the outsiders, Europeans coming in. Often when people think about our stories, it starts with the point of contact with Europeans. Even our own historians, when they retell our stories, they start with the contact of the Europeans. So the average Sierra Leonean doesn't really have that mental space or that intellectual space to even think what this day really means or what it is to them in any way. For most of them, it's a day to take a break from work and to celebrate a fallacy, really, of being free, which doesn't exist because we have forgotten who we are and we don't have any of these in our curriculums to understand our true history, our power, so that we feel seen in the world on our terms, not based on how everybody else has portrayed us. See.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that it's perceived as just a day to kind of just take off, because, as Ishmael was saying, it's the context of independence is not necessarily celebrating our identities, and it's really just, okay, this is what happened. We're free from the British, but we haven't really done the work to say, okay, how have we preserved, Mende culture, Creole, Temne, Mandinka, like all these people that, have played a part in Sierra Leone history. We're not celebrating that. We're not talking about that. It's really just, okay, the British aren't here anymore. I guess we'll celebrate, but there's really no grasp of who we are. There's no concept of who we are. We don't, that I think should be celebrated. And that's something that we don't necessarily do. So I feel like Sierra Leone is often very separated into like, okay, this is upcountry, this is Freetown, and that's it. And we just stick with these generalizations. And I really wish we would take more time to embrace the individual histories we have, and also, the solidarity we have as a country. So I think there's a pride there in the beauty of Sierra Leone and, how gorgeous our mountains and our beaches are. And so people will celebrate, but it's very surface level. And yeah, I think it's just very surface level, and there really isn't a deep-rooted history that we're celebrating.
I want to get into a question which I was going to ask later, but we're moving to that. I may as well ask that first, and then we'll ask these other questions, which is there is something here about when you say upcountry versus Freetown, or everybody's in Freetown. We have to then, I suppose, talk also about, and you talk about what does freedom mean, where does it start? Freedom was there before the British got here, so that means we have to, in a way, also address like the idea of Sierra Leone, like how did it come about? That it came about as, and you could correct me, as this attempt by the British to deal with their own problems around what would be the descendants of slaves that are in Britain, and so we are going to go start a country for them, and then other freed slaves from the Americas also arrive there. So can you both, maybe, I know these are long, complicated histories, but how much of what is involved in the founding of Sierra Leone is also part of like what needs to be, if there was going to be like some point, a truth and well, I know there has been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission of some sort, but if there has to be a reckoning with the whole past, how much of that, of the founding, also needs to be part of the story of where does Sierra Leone begin and end? And some of the tensions that also brought up is also here when we talk about it.
Well, so you're asking exactly how do we rectify all of Sierra Leone's past in order to move forward? Well, we have to acknowledge all of it. right? And I think a lot of people just don't. It's because Sierra Leone also had a large Yoruba presence. It also, it has that history of the undesirable Blacks coming from Nova Scotia. It has all of that. But I think it goes back to people telling us who we were, and then just over the years it being cast aside because we were dealing with so much else. So we have to make an effort to actually bring all of it back. But do people care? So we have to figure out, how to do that, how to make people actually want to care about their identities and want to care about this past. Because if they don't, and it's not priority, then how are we ever really going to move forward?
The way I want to jump into this question, on such a day, and we were talking about this, Sean and William, that, I rather not speak about the British necessarily, but somehow it's unavoidable on such a day. Mm-hmm. And if we are going to speak about it, perhaps we should speak about it with a very astute observation of what was done and what kind of political situation they left in this country that still exists, which is why we continue to have the problems we have. So there are several dates that are very important. In 1787, it's when the colony was founded for the free slaves to return, right? And so even the language that is used to express that says that the British merchant philanthropist. How are you a philanthropist and if you are in the business of slavery? Let's look at that, right? So, but already there's a problem in the way they are presenting themselves against the place they are going or the people they are bringing there, right? So then the second date is in 1808. That became a colony, which basically landed. They went to the Timini chief, and they deceived the Timini chief and asked for a parcel of land that they then later on made into a territory, right? Into a colony, basically for the free slaves that were coming, and the problem that you mentioned they had in England that they wanted to rectify by taking them out there to deal with it, right? So then in 1896, the people who are now in this colony were considered British subjects. So which were the free slaves, so which in effect they were working for the British Empire. And then the British decided that they could not maintain this financially, so they needed to go in the interior. So in 1896, then Sierra Leone, the rest of Sierra Leone became a protectorate. And these were protected persons by the British. So all of a sudden, we went from just a country that has an area that has its own history to now being protectorates of the British, right? And so what this legal distinction, this distinction is very important, because then you have the Western area, which was the British colony, and then you have the British protectorate, which was the rest of the country. And there were two legal systems that dealt with these two areas. One were British subjects, the other ones were British protected persons. And so the economic model, everything that transpired was based on this. And even the idea of how paramount chiefs are formed and everything was based on the British being able to control everything, So to this day, that's a system we have in place. So which gives you a lot of indication of how Sierra Leone is to this day, where power is in the Western area, where access to resources is in the Western area, and the rest of the country continues to crumble to a large extent. You see what I mean? So until we're able to even look at this history from that point of view and realize the consolidation of power by the British Empire was to basically just get resources from inland into the country and take it out to the empire. And that still happens to some extent in the way the political system is. So on this day, if we don't talk about that and challenge that and undo that and go back to the way things used to be, which were there was a more of a federalization of things. Politics was not concentrated in one area; it was everywhere. This is the old ancient African empire way of doing this. People already knew there were political systems in place. So why don't we revisit that? Because clearly this one hasn't worked for us that was set up. And so I don't know why we're still embracing it.
Well, that's kind of why I bring up, the idea of the mindset in the country, because we can go back to the way things were in terms of like how we ruled politically, gender roles and things like that. But do people actually want to? There are so many still, speaking honestly, if you go to Sierra Leone right now, there are a lot of still like colonial mindsets there. So we can keep talking about the history and what things were done to us, but really is going to take a certain point in time for us to be like, okay, this was our history. Now moving forward, we need to change our thinking. We need to want more for ourselves. We need to want to return back to that. So that's why I think it's a mixture of like the education of who we are and who we were, but also like people really need to want it in order to have that change.
I would jump, but I think the idea of I believe that because there was a way to capture the mind of the person who was colonized, which was a deliberate move that was done. There's also a way to undo that, and I think it has to be a national effort. And the way we undo that is from a very young age to begin to teach our children an idea of who they are, what their identity truly is, And once that starts to happen, then people would have questions. For example, I'll tell you, I'm sure you know this, Oluwaseun, in Sierra Leone, when you first start to go to school, which when I was a kid, I thought something was wrong with the song. There's a song that people sing, about Baibure, who was one of the guys who basically fought against the British, because the British had come and imposed a tax on people who were already living on the land. And it was called a hot tax war. And he basically went to the British governor at the time and said, listen, but what is this idea of tax? Can you explain to me? And the guy felt that he was too intelligent. He was going to teach this so-called native, as they called him, about taxation, and said that, well, it's the idea that, if you live on somebody's land, they need to pay taxes for you to be able to. And he said, well, based on your explanation, shouldn't you guys be the ones paying taxes to us? Because you arrived on our land. Why are we the ones, supposedly have this burden of paying taxes to you? And obviously he thought he was a troublesome fellow. And then he mobilized an army and fought against the British for years, gave them a hard time, did in 1 minute. But this is the story that I had to find out later, the depths of it. The one that is given to you as a student in a Sierra Leone education is that Baibura was a warrior. He fought against the British, and the British make him surrender. And he says, Kotomarimo, which means in Timini, he says, I'm sorry, forgive me. So as a young person growing up in Sierra Leone, all of a sudden you feel an inferiority about who you are. This hero of yours begged, even though he was fighting for his right? And as a kid, I knew that story doesn't make sense. Because how is this guy who started a war against them for years, gave them a hard time, how does he only come and say now, oh, I'm so sorry, forgive me, So, but people grow up with this kind of mindset. I told the story because it's important to understand the way the stories are told to us and what we grew up believing about ourselves, about our identity as Sierra Leoneans, what it means, about how we even think about the future. We are aspiring to an ideology that wasn't made in our favor at all. That belittles us, that doesn't even consider our intelligence, our creativity, our ways of being, or rather sets a standard that is unattainable because it doesn't feel natural to us.
There's a lot to ask as a follow-up question. That was brilliant. I suppose what I will start with perhaps is to ask, what is that history that doesn't begin with the colonial encounter in 1787, but is before? I mean, what would that history encompass? What would it communicate, and what would people learn from it? And I mean, what is the challenge of teaching that history? Because I think it's a problem across the continent that our traditions of learning, our traditions of knowing are primarily through oral histories and other practices like that. So how do we teach that history, and what is that history actually?
Well, I mean,
but not just teaching, not.
Sorry, what? I didn't catch that.
I was just going to add to Will's question, which is, it's not just about teaching a history, but also what people often call the usable past. So what from that past, and I get Sayun's point, which is you cannot go back. You're living the the place that is called Sierra Leone has been remade and made and remade into what it is now. But are there things that we could take from that past that does not involve, if you want, the white man as at that time, because it was natives and white men? What can we use from that past? Like, what's usable from that past?
Definitely, the sense of self can work wonders, because if you know that within your past, you were able to build, established societies that were maybe a little bit more balanced than the ones that are now. If you knew that there was gender equality, if you knew that, you were sustainable before any of this happened, then you can be like, okay, well, actually, this is attainable. So let me try and bridge these gaps from who we were to where we are and see how we can get back to that. And so that's the main thing. It's just like, it's not so much teaching the history, like you said, but knowing that this is possible. Because I think a lot of people have the mindset of, well, if it's not on my plate, I don't really care. And then there's also a complacency with how things are going. So because of, there's other things to worry about. But I think if you're a person living in a society saying, okay, I don't know what my options are, I can't get access to this education, I can't do this or that, I think it's more of you will be more motivated to try and attempt, knowing that it has, existed before and that you can try and attain it again, as opposed to just feeling like this place of despair, this hole, because, this country was always just like this hole of destruction and there's no way of getting out of it.
I think that the very act of deciding to go and reevaluate that history and look at it is in self power. And that's power that's going to be rooted in the idea of Black Africa, which I think has been shown to not have had anything until others came and said, this is how you can be, right? And returning to that and correcting that narrative itself, all of a sudden gives the young person growing up to know that people who look like me had done things already ahead of time, had planned, had built, had skill sets, had organizations, had did these things that are actually should have been a model. But those stories were built. And to go to William, when you talked about oral tradition, even the very idea of oral tradition, when it's looked at it as this negative, unreliable source of information, right? Whereas if it's written, then all of a sudden it becomes fact, right? Now, who gave that idea to us? Who made us believe that that's how it's supposed to be? Obviously, the Europeans, the others, so that they can say, your history is not reliable, it's not good enough, and here is ours. When we're going to write it for you and we're going to tell you how it goes. What people don't realize about the idea of oral tradition is not that Black African societies did not know how to read or write. They knew. They created language. Even in Sierra Leone, we have a language called Kikakwi, from a guy who started writing the Mende language way before any white man set foot on the Sierra Leone landscape, right? So the people knew how to read and write. The reason why they did not do that, because they realized that there's democracy, there's freedom in the idea of orally having a story, because it forces you to really listen deeply and take the story. And also the story cannot be monopolized, because then it belongs to everybody if it's passed orally. Once you write it, it's in a book. Then if I live in the interior, I don't have access to book, I can no longer get that information. That information now becomes power that can be used against me. This is the idea, but nobody knows this because everybody says, oh, oral tradition is so reliable. But let's unpack it also. The others who said that, when they came and experienced whatever they experienced on that land, they went and wrote it from their memory of it into books. So it's the same concept. But the idea is that even that alone, we're unafraid to return to that because we think, oh, it's unreliable. It is not. Why don't we go back to those that are still living and read Cheikh Anta Diop and look at all these other things that talk about Black African civilizations that were there and see what we can take from it to live in the current day that we're living in. That very act itself is resistance to undoing the mindset that's been created, but also to having us be in charge of the kind of future we want. Because if we don't do that, any other model we choose creates a reliance on the other to succeed, to survive, to be free. Even the definition of that is based on what they would ascribe to us, right? So I think the very act of any nation deciding that they want to shift and return to that day should be the Independence Day to celebrate, when a nation fully decides to do that.
Mm-hmm.
To maybe ask now as a Sean's joined. I think he wants to ask something.
Unless you had a follow-on, I had a question for Sehun. Unless you had a follow-on, Will.
No, go ahead.
So just to slightly change tack, so you've written in the past about what it means to be a woman in Sierra Leone, and you've written that you actually wrote a piece for Africa as a Country about that. Has women's liberation, if we're thinking about Independence Day, has women liberation in Africa, including in Sierra Leone, has it always been postponed? Is it always been postponed?
Yes. So I think it's twofold. So it's very tough being a woman in general. And then in Africa and Sierra Leone, it's not unique, right? So I think on an institutional and societal scale, yes, it's always been, we're always put in the back seat, when our existence drives the whole continent, right? So I'd say that there are current liberation movements started by African women and Sierra Leonean women, like amongst ourselves. If anything, we're the ones caring for each other, providing some sort of education, safe spaces, and that's what's moving progress forward. But doing that work on the ground needs support, because a lot of the time, because we are women, we're often met with opposition when we're doing that work. So it has to be more. It has to be on a governmental scale. It has to be institutional. So like specifically to Sierra Leone, like how many state of emergencies for like rape and sexual assault are you going to declare before you actually determine that this is a real problem that needs actionable steps? How many occurrences of gender-based violence, how many, small children have to testify that they've been assaulted by grown men, before you're actually like, okay, what is at the core of this? And I think what we have to ask is like, why are we as Sierra Leonean women or African women not seen as important enough to fight for? So it's like, it's really going to take a shift in mindset, which I think will take time, but we keep putting these pretty Band-Aids on it, like having these like events, like, yeah, we're doing stuff, but very much in my mind, the problem that we have with gender equality needs to be like snatched from the root, because as they say, it's the only way to get rid of the rot. What's the root of the misogyny? Are they leftover colonial ideas? Is this just how we are? What's leading us down these paths? I had a very harrowing, traumatic experience with my sister's disappearance like 2 years ago in Sierra Leone. And dealing with the government and embassies and the police, it's just so clear that women are just like not top of mind in these overall discussions of liberation and taking care and just in our place in society. So absolutely, I think women's liberation in Sierra Leone, not on, definitely in the governmental level and, just how we set up our institutional structures, they're absolutely postponed. I don't think you can deny it.
Ismail?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Oluwaseun said, and also, I think in Sierra Leone and everywhere around the world, I think Black women have always been not given the proper gratitude, sort of the space to express their power. If you look at any liberation movement anywhere in the world, the driving forces behind it are always Black women, anywhere. Give me a current day situation that's going on. Black Lives Matter, who are the people behind it? Black women are always the ones, exactly. Black women are always the ones who are pushing and carrying societies forward. If you think of any good president, any good leader anywhere in the world, they're successful because they have a very intelligent Black woman behind them who does not come forward because they're egoless and they allow things to go. And the reason why this is important for people to know is that when we don't tell these stories, then we have people growing up not really seeing the value and the importance and the reason why we're where we are is because we don't support our Black women as strongly as possible. We don't give them the space to contribute, really. We do it performatively in a way.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at our history, for example, we're talking about Baibure and the resistance movement you had against the British. We had a woman called Nyaro. She was the military mind behind all of the organization. If you read history, you will never find her. It's like as if it doesn't exist. So the young girl growing up would aspire to marriage, not knowing that she's actually a force that drives society. You understand? So I think all of these things need to be done. And we're, as an African, Black African man, we have to do more to actually show the importance of our women, that without them, we will not be where we are. Without them, we will not even be discussing the idea of freedom. But that's not on any national agenda at all. So I think we need to change that narrative. And in Sierra Leone, it is sad. I do some work with the United Nations, with UNICEF in particular, and I've been on the ground several times to listen to harrowing stories about young girls at a very young age that don't feel safe in their own country just by the very fact of being a girl, you know? Even their teachers sometimes become their assaulters, you know? So we have a society that's very toxic like that, you know? Mm-hmm. And I have two Black Sierra Leonean and many other things. They are from different places, girls, and I don't want them to grow up in an environment where they have to fear just because of their gender. I want them to grow up in an environment where they have to thrive because they're intelligent, because they're human beings. That's it, not because of their gender. So you have these issues that are there. And it starts very little. We don't address it at a very small level. It starts with these little expressions that people have, you know. For example, people come and say, "Oh, look at this little girl. Oh, this one is going to be my young wife."
Yep.
And people laugh. Somebody says that to my daughter, you're going to have a big problem with me, because this is where it starts. You condone that, and then the person takes the next step further. You see what I mean? So we are not vigorous as Black African men in protecting our women and in speaking for them. And I think we need to do that. The burden is not on them. It's on us. We the men, all three of us here. Right.
I mean, when it comes, you know, that's a very good challenge, and to think broadly now. The way you describe these problems is that they exist at a structural level. It implicates the entire society, and it's interwoven into every institution, every single actor. And when we think about Sierra Leonean politics today, so far it's become this dance between two dominant political parties. And when one thinks about the prospects of things changing, when you look at the Sierra Leone People's Party or the All People's Congress, it's probably not going to look like it's going to come from them, because, you know, as some of our greatest national liberation heroes, like, you know, Kwame Nkrumah, who celebrating birthday today also, I mean, they warned of this possibility that in the post-colonial context, the people who are your liberators can also become your oppressors. Yes. So when it comes to the question of where Sierra Leone goes after this, I'm curious to know who are the social forces, the groups in Sierra Leonean society who are giving glimpses of the future that we envision for Sierra Leone, that is able to achieve all of the things we wanted to. Who's making this argument in the public sphere? Who's pushing this emancipatory politics forward so that we can watch out for them and, of course, show our solidarity? Any idea of what's happening there?
Yeah, there are. So, you know, there are actually quite a number of them. And I actually think it's great that the internet exists, because they're able to connect with each other. And I'm very bad at thinking of things top of mind, but I can provide suggestions later. But I think ultimately, I just want to stress, though, that while there are so many young people, Africa is always driven by its people. And it's always very important to, you know, we have people power, and that's always been our greatest strength. But I really want to stress that we can't keep having these little independent bubbles where we're all trying to fight the struggle. We do need foundations so that we can build on them and have sustainable growth and sustainable change. And that's really going to take with like community and us like working with each other and combining together. Because while there are a lot of like organizations on the ground in Sierra Leone, it's like, yeah, we need to just combine it, because it's not going to be one person is on this avenue, another person is on this avenue, and we don't know which one is always going. So while there's amazing, awesome people, and like it's hard to do that work, I just wanted to like say that though, that we need to find each other and discuss and talk and plan with each other a lot more, because that's like the only way we're actually going to have something that can really drive things forward.
I believe that one of the things that happened, which is an accidental blessing for Sierra Leone, is that because of the civil war, it pushed a lot of Sierra Leoneans who may otherwise would not have had any access to anything to leave the country by way of trying to just survive, and thereby were able to be exposed to a larger world, to understand what is going on outside. And so they learned, because of that, those that were willing to learn a lot of things, and they reflected looking at their own country where they've just escaped and ran from. So we have a lot of those type of people that returned. We also have people who did not live and stayed on the ground, but were still intelligent enough to sift through things and understand. And I think that what is going to drive this nation forward is a combination of those two people to kind of see which Sierra Leone we want in the future. And I think that has already started with the current government. Sierra Leone is a broken country. So sometimes while you're trying to plan for the future, you also have to make sure that there is a foundation somewhat, so that things don't sink too deep, So, and often what happens is that then people just get stuck at trying to lay that foundation, and somehow forgot that you need to be building the next 5, 6, 7, 10 waves of thinkers to be able to do that. So often there is not space for intellectual thought in Sierra Leone because it's not regarded as something that moves society. Power, in the raw sense of it, is thought of as something, but we've all seen that that's not the case. Throughout our history, we've seen when we've had very, very young people came into power without all the burdens of the political systems, what they have done and how that has changed the country. It set it on a path that was very, it looked possible for this country to be prosperous in many ways. But then that changed quickly because those young people felt that they did not understand necessarily how to carry that burden. So I think what needs to change is this idea that you don't need to be old to be in a position to make a difference. You don't need to be a big man. You can start moving.
Funny you say that. I looked earlier today, and it struck me. It's that kind of thing. I've seen that stat. I've seen the statistic many times. I've quoted it in tweets, but today it hit me, and I remember I just tweeted it from the Africa as a Country account, which is that you realize that Patrice Lumumba, when he took on the Belgians in 1960, and that led to his murder 1 year later, he died when he was 35 years old. And I wrote the word 35 in capital letters to your point about this idea that young people cannot run things, or he was 35 years old. By the age of 35, he had taken on the colonial, the Kingdom of Belgium, right? If you think of Malcolm X, 39, you think of, I think Martin Luther King Jr. was also 39. I mean, these are people were relatively young. Steve Biko was 23. But we don't think of, we think in the sort of venerated, the leader must always be an old man. I mean, I mentioned only men, as examples of this. But you could similarly, you'll find that, Josina, Machel, etc. These were very young people when they lost their lives, and we sort of assume that it's somebody who is relatively old. It has to be somebody who's old and who's an older man.
No, it's absolutely has to come from a young person because, I mean, so many African countries are ruled by dinosaurs right now, and it's really not leading us in the right direction. It has to come from young people. And there's actually two groups came to mind. Girls Empowerment Sierra Leone is a cool one. And then I came across another one, the Young Sierra Leoneans, and I think they're based in England, actually. But, you know, these groups are coming about from young people. And that's the ticket to change. It has to be, but it goes back to the representation, right? If you see it, then you can say, okay, I can do that too. And you have that sense of self to say, okay, I don't have to wait for someone to tell me that I'm important to believe that I'm important. I know it because, you know, it's around me and I know that history. So it all ties together.
You know, I want to tell you, it goes to what Sean just said. You know, this is really the importance of understanding our own history. What you just mentioned about the Patrice Lumumbas, about the Steve Biko, you know, about all these sort of the Thomas Sankaras, about these Black African leaders who were pushing against empires at a very young age and succeeded to a large extent in making sure certain things were in place, even though it cost them their lives, you know. If you grow up understanding this kind of history, then you don't feel powerless, you know, then you realize that you actually can contribute as well. But we don't grow up looking at it from that perspective. We grow up seeing it as, I don't know, sometimes you don't even know it until you leave your own country to learn about some of these things. You know, I was fortunate enough, since today is South Africa is celebrating its own version of this independence, you know. One of the things that happened to me that was quite important to me in my development as a thinker was that when I fled Sierra Leone, I happened to go to South Africa. And this was in 1995, 96. So South Africa was just coming out of apartheid. And I was in that environment, just having come from Sierra Leone, not really having a consciousness of my Blackness to some extent. You know, I had seen injustices based on that, but I didn't know. And I was in this South African environment. I was living with an Afrikaans family in a neighborhood that was predominantly white South Africans. And I just went everywhere and people had this reaction to me that was very weird. So I actually started to learn quite a bit about what this, you know, and then of course I got drawn to the Steve Bikos and things that I started to read. And I thought to myself, whoa, there's something deeper. So again, exposure to our own histories. It doesn't just have to be in Sierra Leone, just general Black African history. It is critical, absolutely critical. In South Africa, you have South African young people who will tell you more about what is going on in popular music in the United States than they will tell you what's going on in Central African Republic next door, right? So these things need to change. This is the education I'm talking about how, yeah.
Well, thank you very much to the both of you, because I think some of that has happened tonight. I mean, this evening it has been an education,